In every great story, there is a shadow, a figure who operates by a different set of rules, a disruption to the natural order. In One Piece, that shadow is Blackbeard, a man who preaches dreams but moves like a curse. He doesn't sleep, his body defies logic, and he holds powers that no one else can seem to survive. And now, spoiler alert, we know that he is the son of Rox D. Xebec, the most dangerous criminal that the world has ever seen. But with each new answer, it only deepens the mystery. None of this should work, but yet it somehow does. So, welcome to Theory Corner, a space where we seek to explore the stories behind stories, the alternate paths, hidden logics, things that almost happened, what ifs, but not for predictions, but to offer different perspectives on these stories that we consume.
Темная ночь, только пули свистят по степи.
Before we go any further, I think it's important to address two of the most common theories surrounding Blackbeard. I chose these two specifically because I feel like they kind of distill some of the common ideas behind Blackbeard and how his story works. The Kraken Cerberus fruit idea and the Ope Ope no Mi soul transfer theory. Both of these have gained traction over the years, but I feel as though none of them hold up when we measure against what we have now. So let's start with the most recent one, the Ope Ope no Mi theory, which, as alluded to, has actually picked up steam quite recently. It hinges on the idea that Xebec used the fruit's perpetual youth surgery to transfer his soul into Blackbeard at the moment of his death, supposedly making Teach a vessel for his consciousness. The major flaw here is that when Law used the Ope Ope no Mi during the Wano arc, neither Big Mom nor Kaido, members of the original Rocks Pirates, recognized it. If the fruit had played such a pivotal role in Xebec's life, it would have left a long-lasting impression. But instead, they treat it as just another powerful ability, no recognition or panic. On top of that, Blackbeard himself actively gets Law to try and perform the surgery on him. If he had already contained Xebec's soul or benefited from a prior use of the fruit, then there would be no need to pursue it again, no? I think this suggests that there's not only a lack of knowledge about such an event, but a lack of experience with the fruit altogether. Now let's segue to the Cerberus/Kraken theory. This one has lasted for quite a while now, and it argues that Blackbeard's ability to contain multiple devil fruits and souls stems from him having a mythical Zoan, a three-souled creature like a Cerberus or some Kraken-based beast. I will admit, it is very catchy, and it makes sense considering that Blackbeard does go after other devil fruit users, and he has a Logia and a Paramecia already. But I still feel like this doesn't hold. For one, Oda rarely introduces power without narrative justification. Think about Yamato. For months, fans speculated what her fruit would be and if it would reflect her character. And in the end, it actually kinda did. A mythical wolf tied to protection and traditional Japanese legend. In which case, that would directly tie into Wano from One Piece. The Oda never really does anything to just do it. It usually has some kind of narrative significance. Furthermore, Blackbeard doesn't ever display transformations typical of Zoan users. No partial animal states, no hybrid forms, no recovery boosts. His abilities are distinctly non-Zoan. If anything, his physiology seems to reject the traditional structure of devil fruit logic, not reinforce it. Thematically, Oda leans into symbolism that has roots in the story's deeper structure, science, lineage, the burden of inherited will, not necessarily beasts pulled from Western mythology with no cultural or narrative significance to the world of One Piece. These theories are popular because they are visual, but as we already know, One Piece isn't built on spectacle alone, it's built on consistency. Now, when One Piece often wants to explain the impossible, it turns to science, quietly, methodically, piece by piece. Now, Sanji initially was introduced as just another cook with a strong kick, but over time, it became clear that his body didn't work like everyone else's. He could survive fire, push through injuries, and move at speeds beyond explanation. The reveal didn't come from prophecy or a hidden bloodline, it came from engineering. Judge, his father, and one of the original members of MADS had already altered his children at the genetic level using a discovery called the lineage factor, a biological code that defines what something can become. This same scientific thread can be seen to run through Blackbeard in a similar way. I mean, his body is frequently described as strange. Marco, who is a doctor and has practically seeing every wound and quirk that a pirate can carry, specifically calls it abnormal. Blackbeard doesn't sleep, he can contain more than one devil fruit, and now one of the five elders, Saturn, identified his special lineage as something worth noting. None of this is presented as mystical. The vocabulary stays grounded: lineage, structure, biology. The story isn't necessarily giving us a riddle, it's giving us a trail to follow. And that begins with the same building blocks that turned Sanji into something unexplainable. To understand how this happened, we need to find a link. Someone who stood close enough to rocks to know the value of his bloodline, and close enough to Mads to access the science being developed behind closed doors. Well, that person is Stussy. She wasn't just part of the Rocks pirates. She was later confirmed to be a freeloader inside the Mads lab, quietly absorbing knowledge, moving between two of the most dangerous factions in history without ever taking the spotlight. Her role makes her the perfect bridge, the woman who knew both what Xebec left behind and what could be done with it. After the fall of Rocks, the world government wiped everything connected to him from the record. But I would imagine that, similar to Roger, they wanted to clean the past entirely. If Xebec had a child, that child would have become a liability and a target. Unless someone intervened. Stussy keeps Blackbeard alive, not out of loyalty or sentiment, but because she sees what he represents. The Son of Rocks is more than a legacy. He can be seen as raw material. With access to Judge and Mads, she has the means. With Teach, she has the subject. Not for cloning, not yet at least, but for something more ambitious. The earliest experimentation with the lineage factor. And to push it further, she would need something rare, something the world was just beginning to fear. Now, there's two possible setups. There's either the possibilities that Blackbeard was born from a Buccaneer woman or modified using Buccaneer lineage factors after the fact. The result will be the same: a body that carries the traits that the world wasn't prepared to understand. We know that Buccaneers possess remarkable resilience. Kuma's story confirms that. But a deeper insight comes directly from Dr. Vegapunk. He points out that even after Kuma was completely overwritten, his personality stripped, memory suppressed, brain function all but shut down, there were still flashes of consciousness. He still responded, he still moved with purpose. Something remained. According to Vegapunk, this isn't by accident. It's part of the Buccaneer biology, a hidden trait tied to will itself. Their bodies seem able to preserve fragments of identity even after full neurological shutdown. The theory is that Buccaneers possess a kind of soul-bound resilience, a built-in capacity to anchor consciousness beyond what the body should allow. Now, if Blackbeard inherited that trait, either by birth or experimentation, then his body may have been the first vessel capable of holding multiple powers, multiple states of being, without total collapse. But nothing about it would be stable. The project doesn't succeed. It produces something unstable, a body that resists sleep, resists harmony, resists explanation, a prototype that couldn't be controlled, refined, or repeated. Blackbeard was never part of a long-term plan. It wasn't designed to be mass-produced. He was the early test, the unpredictable outcome of mixing Buccaneer biology with Rox D. Xebec's bloodline and exposing it to science that hadn't yet figured out how to ask permission. His body develops the capacity to hold more than one devil fruit, but the trade-off is structural imbalance, a splintered sense of identity, possible over-awareness, chronic sleeplessness, physical anomalies that no doctor could categorize. The suggestion is that the world's first exposure to soul-bound resilience, a trait that let him survive what should have destroyed him, not just physically, but mentally. So if Blackbeard was the first attempt, a prototype that failed under its own volatility, maybe Weevil was the second. This time, the process might have been more measured. We could theorize that the focus wasn't this time on suppressing will entirely, but avoiding instability that made Teach impossible to manage. The goal was perhaps strength with fewer internal variables, something powerful but predictable. Weevil fits that idea. He has overwhelming combat ability. His strength isn't in question. But he's not volatile. He doesn't drive his own agenda. He responds, he obeys, and he fights. But he doesn't scheme. He doesn't lead, he follows. Now, whether this outcome was intentional or just a byproduct of overcorrection is not entirely clear, but he may not have been built to be mentally limited, but in trying to reduce the chaos they encountered with Teach, they may have corrected something that lacked the complexity needed to adapt. Now, Weevil is widely believed to carry genetic material from Whitebeard, another legendary figure known for his sheer physical power. And just like with Teach, the same scientific fingerprints are there, the same quiet network, the same ambition buried just underneath the surface. Two prototypes, one with too much autonomy, the other not enough. Neither gave them what they were after. Now, at some point, we know that Blackbeard eventually would have to leave. Whether Blackbeard escaped or was quietly released, potentially with Stussie's involvement, we know that he walks away from the Ellie experiment with the truth about who he is, about what was done. That moment becomes the fracture point, not just for Teach, but for the science that created him. Sometime later, the world government are confirmed to have made a move on Mads. Their attention, likely already focused on Vegapunk's growing influence, sharpened. They uncovered traces of the experimentation, lineage factor, manipulation, test subjects, and normal outcomes. And it doesn't sit well as they feel threatened. So they arrest the group, shut it down, but not because the research was useless, but because the risk of leaving it unchecked became too great. That includes knowledge of Blackbeard. But the world government doesn't exactly erase data. They just don't go public, but they do not forget. From that point on, the work continues, just more carefully, for them, more deliberately, and they take lessons from Teach's failure and begin laying the groundwork for something more stable, something that can monitor, which eventually became the Pacifistas and the Seraphims. So, the next phase started quietly, but the man that they tried to file away keeps on moving. The little we see of Teach's early life suggests hardship, cold islands, isolation, no home or a legacy. But eventually he surfaces, not in rebellion or in chaos, but under a flag, Whitebeard's. Now, I don't think this was an accident. The sheep he approaches is the safest place in the world to disappear in plain sight, strong enough to shield him and respected enough to make questions go quiet. He joins the crew, keeps his head down and serves. For decades he works without distinction, not drawing loyalty, but not drawing suspicion either. So it's kinda easy to assume that Whitebeard just didn't notice him, that he was blind to what was in front of him. But to me, that doesn't line up. I mean, Whitebeard knew who Xebec was. And not just through reputation, he was literally his right-hand man, and they shared a ship. So when Teach joined the Whitebeard pirates, a child with the will of D, and a face not far removed from Xebec's, it's kinda hard to imagine that Whitebeard didn't notice. Admittedly though, whether he pieced it all together is still uncertain. But I don't think he needed a blood test to sense what was right in front of him. But he still let Teach aboard. Is it because he trusted him? I don't think so. But Whitebeard lived by a code. The past doesn't own you. A man isn't condemned by the sins of his father, only by his own choices. Whitebeard saw a child warped by something larger than himself, a product of powers that he likely despised, and instead of casting him out, he gave him a structure, family, a place to belong. But not just as a gift, also as a tether, because whether he knew the details or not, Whitebeard could feel it. Teach wasn't just another crewmate, it was something that needed to be watched. Even before Tash's death, something was off about Blackbeard. He was quiet, careful, almost too careful, a presence that never quite settled, like a fault line waiting to split open. So when the betrayal came, Whitebeard didn't just mourn the loss of Tash, he prepared for what Teach's actions meant. That's why he warned Ace, not because he thought Ace was weak or Teach was unbeatable, but because he understood. Teach wasn't necessarily acting out of greed or revenge. He was following a path that had started long before either of them had met, one rooted in things that even Whitebeard may not have fully understood, but he felt it deep in his spirit. When they finally faced off at Marineford, notice that Whitebeard never called him wicked or evil. He called him unworthy. He says, that wasn't condemnation, it was clarity. Teach wasn't born evil, but a version that stood before him, hungry, splintered, untethered, wasn't someone who could carry the future forward. He wasn't a beacon. It was the aftermath of something broken. And Whitebeard had always known. He hadn't taken in a monster, but he had taken in something that the world had no name for. That line wasn't about faith. It was about prophecy. It was Whitebeard drawing a line, not against teacher's strength, but against what he represented. The hunger, the distortion, the attempt to force inheritance through power alone. He watched it fester, and now, with the world watching, he made sure Teach would never be mistaken for a true successor. Now, due to a combination of events, Blackbeard goes undetected by the world government for years. Not just because he was clever, but because the world had already buried the threat that he represented. Rox was dead, the God Valley incident was erased, and whatever Blackbeard was, it stayed silent until the silence was no longer useful. By the time the attention lands on him, he doesn't show up as a mystery. He shows up as a candidate, a pirate turning in another pirate, a name with value, a proposal. Make me a warlord. And his plan works for two reasons. First off, he positions himself on a global scale. His actions are decisive and explosive, but never quite revealing, not enough to draw a line back to the Rox incident. Second of all, he frames himself as useful, a tool, a pawn to the world government, not a threat. And for a government that's obsessed with control, that's all it took. Now, as Blackbeard rises, warlord to emperor, the world finally begins to notice him. But something else slips by, quiet and almost invincible. The name of his ship, Saber of Xebec. Now to me, this detail is subtext from Oda himself, a choice meant to echo. The same way Roger naming his son after his blade hinted at inheritance beyond blood. This feels like the author placing a marker that maybe Blackbeard isn't just a byproduct of Rox. He's the continuation, a will that didn't die. If my theory's right, it may go even further. The Buccaneer trait, as Vegapunk began to uncover, might not just be resilience of body, it could be the endurance of something deeper. Not memory, not identity, but will. A force that lingers, that attaches, that survives. Soul-bound resilience. Look at Kuma for instance. Kuma walked without a mind, fulfills promises with no programming. And Blackbeard, if that same trait flows in him, he may not just be echoing Xebec's will, he may be carrying it. Not through some surgery, not because he asked to, but because he's built to. And that might be what makes him truly dangerous. The world sees Blackbeard now, but for decades he moved in silence, shielded by the very people who might have stopped him, hidden beneath the legacy of someone far louder. There's something about him that resists definition, too strange to be a product of nature, too methodical to be ruled by chaos, too quiet for something who always wins loud. We don't know how much he understands about what he is, but he moves like someone who's felt overlooked his entire life and intends to make sure that never happens again. Whatever built him, whatever broke him, Blackbeard isn't just dangerous because of what he's done. He's dangerous because of what he can still do.